FemC's, that is the option for Persona and SMT games to have a female protagonist as well as a male one, is perhaps one of the most requested features of the series, and yet is also one strangely absent in most games, being limited to only SMT if Imagine and a single version of Persona 3. During an interview with Neo Persona director Katsuro Hashino-San with the release of Persona 5, he gave insight into why this feature is often absent, saying that it is often considered, but because of the things needed to be cut to compensate for the workload, the gender selection option is, quote, not worth it. I have a problem with this reasoning. The confusing explanation given put forth for why the FemC was okay in Portable but not in P4, as well as how silent protagonists are implemented in Persona in general. Personally, I'd say that the best way to implement a silent protagonist would probably be with a character creator and customizer. I can understand not having the budget for that, but a single extra model with a script hook to replace the characters in certain cutscenes? Yeah, there is a reason why FemC mods are completed only months after a game's release. The old tall tale about it being another third of the game is also untrue, and many indie games do have this as an option from the ground up. So there really isn't an excuse on that front. In fact, a working demo for the FemC mod of Reload was available mere days after Reload's release. Nevertheless, there are those who argue similarly in spite of these facts, such as with this Reddit post that highlights the supposed difficulty of implementing a FemC, ignoring again the brevity between the releases of games and their corresponding FemC mods. Now, if you want to argue that the specific scope of the FemC is difficult, then that's a legitimate complaint. P3P's FemC had a lot of features added to make experiencing the story through her perspective distinct. While I'm sure that these are appreciated, they really weren't necessary, and just a model change with distinct animations would be enough for most people. And switching to gender-neutral they-them for some dialogue would also work to reduce the need for multiple takes of dialogue for when the pronouns don't need to be gendered. I also personally find the horrid pink overlay on blue to really be ugly in Reload's FemC mod, and feel like the somber blue is better for Persona 3 as a narrative than the light pink. So drastically changing the UI is really unnecessary, even detrimental to the game's aesthetic, given the emphasis on a singular color found in Neo Persona onwards. New music would also be redundant, and social links can be largely identical to the male counterparts, with only minor script differences to account for variables like pronouns, which is again just a variable in the code. 2D animation would by far be the biggest hurdle, and is the most reasonable of these stated to work around, again because of budget and time constraints, and a version of the opening of the FemC over MC would definitely be needed. But beyond that, this hurdle can be worked around by having the majority of events be with the protagonist in 3D scenes, and focusing anime cutscenes on events without the main protagonist, such as sending the calling cards, victims appearing on the TV, wide shots introducing new locations, and so forth. One mod attempted for Persona 4 called Rose Golden actually attempted a lot of the things laid out in this Reddit post, and never came to fruition because of this ambition and workload that resulted from a small team. So I don't deny that the actual scope could be an issue if the developers get carried away with the gimmick, but again, just the option with minimal changes beyond is what most people want. They want to play as a FemC, some for the gimmick, and others because they are girls and want to play as themselves, or at least closer to themselves than they feel the MC offers. I know that they're kind of an awkward in-between that don't truly capitalize on the advantages of a silent protagonist that allow for a more personalized narrative impact, but Persona protagonists are still, at least on paper, silent protagonists. Meaning that there really isn't a good reason not to have this feature when it allows for more people to enter the game's world as the intended protagonist. This brings us to the rationale Hashino-san gave to why the gender select option is absent in most Persona games, and what the interviewer Saeem Ahmed had to say on it. To first quote Hashino-san, "To put a gender select option into the game, we'd have to cut other things to compensate for the workload, and every time that's a situation we'll say, it's not worth it." Pause quote. Though the interviewer does not transcribe the next question, they do apparently bring up the topic of Persona 3, its relation to later games in the franchise, and why FMC was okay in Portable, but not in later installments such as P4, which is the example that Hashino-san directly responds to and uses to give a reasoning for while being strangely silent on Persona 5, which this interview was originally about. Now resuming quote. With the way that game's world worked, it was okay for the protagonist to be female. With Persona 4 though, we needed the character to come from a big city to a small country town to be the driving force of the story, and it seemed more natural for a male character to fulfill that role. There are story aspects to this decision as well." End quote. It is here that the interviewer gives their 2 cents on this reasoning and why they believe this line of logic is ludicrous, a sentiment that I wholeheartedly agree with. Quote, "This seems so bizarre to me. In a fantastical situation where people are turned into coffins and the local school transforms into a twisted tower of deadly enemies, being a girl is fine so long as she's a native of the location in question. But when another Japanese town is plagued by a reality-altering fog, and people keep falling into televisions, you need a dude who's new to the area to take care of that?" End quote. This logic is ridiculous, and what would even need to be cut exactly? The fishing minigame? The crosswords? I could see the Link episodes in Reload being cut, but they're just a replacement for social links anyhow, meaning that the game wouldn't really lose anything. How is arguably the most agreed upon and requested feature of the fanbase not worth it? I'd say that this interview highlights a disconnect felt between the implementation and advantages of silent protagonists versus how they've been kept largely for the sake of tradition, even with conscious attempts by the developers to give them more personality, actively making embracing these strengths more difficult. This warrants its own video down the road, but I personally think that Persona should either abandon the tradition in favor of lead characters, or else take a step back and fully embrace silent protagonists, with the gender option being a key cornerstone in embracing this strength. Especially because the FemC is requested in part because the protagonists are silent, or are supposed to be anyhow. No one requested a gender option in Soul Hackers 2 because the game had a lead character as the protagonist. May not have been the best suited for said story in my opinion, but Ringo is Ringo the main character as opposed to a player insert. I suppose I should end things off with a note that the FemC would not return in Reload beyond the aforementioned mod, which fans went all out on, featuring assets made from the ground up to fit into Reload's pre-existing style and aesthetic, including a customized 3D model with unique animations that recapture portables, a UI attempting to recapture FemC Pink, and even voice acting. I will once again note that given the scope of the FemC in Portable, I find the lack of the FemC option in this instance understandable, but the absence of this feature as an option by default, for the reasons which I assume to be the many features and distinctions made between the 2 routes in Portable, misguided, as they are again unnecessary and counterintuitive to the feature's appeal. Let alone the shaky reasoning actually given that leaves more confusion than clarification in this interview. That said, things have changed. A new era of Persona will begin with Persona 6, headed by fresher team members with new perspectives, who hold the potential to course correct where Persona had previously fumbled, while also making sure to stick to the iconic strengths the Hashino trilogy introduced. I'm on board for seeing this, as well as how Hashino-san and his team will work without the constraints of Persona's identity in the upcoming metaphor. And with any luck, we will eventually see this feature return in future SMT games, where the need to really emphasize the strengths of silent protagonists are needed. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. This wasn't a video that I had intended to make this month, but oh well, life happens and things don't always go as planned. And besides which, I knew that I needed to make a video on the topic once I stumbled upon this old interview. I'm aiming for my next video to be out on either Tuesday or Wednesday, so I'll see you then, and in the meantime, if you enjoyed the video, I would greatly appreciate a like and subscribe, as well as you checking out some of my other videos. On screen now is a video that YouTube recommends you personally based upon the algorithm, and the other one is one that I personally recommend. Also, I would greatly appreciate it if you shared some of your input and perspective on silent protagonists, especially with regards to FemCs, in the comments section below. I am very good at reading and responding to comments, appreciate the discourse, and because I do want to make a video on silent protagonists proper at some point, probably after the release of 5 Vengeance, so that I can use examples from both the most recent SMT and Persona games as well as older ones, any input would be appreciated. Until next time, I am Bilal-kun, and I will see you next week.